Hello, everybody. Oh, it is louder now. So I'm Michelle Starrett. I'm the housing director for Alameda County. That's a big job, but sometimes it's not as comprehensive as I want it to be, so we'll talk about that in a bit. We spent the last year going around the county, holding community meetings, talking to people about many things. What are their housing needs? What are they most worried about? How are their costs? We had a community survey. We took public input in community meetings, in public meetings with Board of Supervisor members. Chris has power. Have a seat. And this plan is the result of all of that work. And this plan, it says a 10-year housing plan, but our goals and objectives are so big, it's probably more like a 30-year plan. But we wanted to be blunt, and we wanted to be bold, and we wanted to actually say what the real problem was. And so one of the things that I was online yesterday, today I'm here in person, one of the things that came up over and over again is poverty. And really the main problem that we have in our country is there is too much poverty. And that poverty leads to homelessness, it leads to lack of education, it leads to lack of economic opportunities, and it is destroying us, in my opinion, but that's, over here. I want to take a moment and appreciate Supervisor Wilma Chan, who passed away a few years ago. Yeah. She was amazing, and her goal was to end poverty. And she was very blunt and clear about it. And she did the work that we need somebody in leadership now to do. In other words, in 2012, 2013, she got Measure A passed, which was more money for healthcare. In 2016, she got Measure A1 passed, which was more money for housing. Yes. In 2019, she put Measure W on the ballot, which was supposed to be more money for homelessness. Of course, we're under a lawsuit and we're still struggling with that. But the point is that it needed local money to even start to attack the problems that we have. And she also put Measure C on the ballot, which was the child care proposition, because we need child care for our working families. So if you think about those four big efforts to put new money initiatives on the ballot, she was tackling every problem that we have. And frankly, we need to continue to tackle those problems. That was just a one thing. It was not a one and done. It was a one thing. We need the 2 and the 3 and the 4 and the 5. It needs to continue because we can't do this work and provide more resources, more services without the resources, the money that comes behind it. So we did a 10-year housing plan. I'd like to introduce Aaron Tiedemann, who's coming in. He's going to actually do this presentation. I've done it so many times, I want other people to do it. And Aaron is going to talk a little about who he is and what our department did. But before I do that, Salima, John, Nick, raise your hands. These are all folks that are on my team. And you worked really hard. How many public meetings did you go to, Salima? A lot. All right, so here's Aaron.
Thank you, Michelle. Morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aaron. I work on Michelle's team as a policy analyst, doing some of this work and doing a lot of the work that goes into our 10-year housing plan. And I recognize that I'm going to talk a lot about data, and it's right after lunch, so if I see you nodding off, I won't be offended, but I think there's interesting stuff to talk about here. So first, a lot of the work we've done as part of this housing plan is understanding the challenge we're facing and analyzing the data we have about what is the problem. And I think a lot of us know that a big part of the problem is housing supply. We have not been building enough for many, many years. As we can see here, basically the last time we were building as much as we needed on an annual basis was in the 80s, and in the past 40 or so years, we have not been building enough in the Bay Area to keep up with demand. That has resulted in our current crisis, in our current housing shortage, and it means that we are just way below that number, and it's going to take us a huge amount of effort and time and funding to dig ourselves out of that. So that's part of what we're looking at here. And we have not even been hitting our average units in the past, about 50 years over the past couple. We're building more than we once were. We've gone up since the financial crisis, but we still need to keep building more. And that's created the affordability crisis. At one time in the United States, with about 2 years of income, you could buy a home. That seems completely far off, I think, as most of us know. And in the Bay Area, it's even worse than it is nationally. In Berkeley or in Oakland, at one time, it was between 2 and 3 years of income that the median household needed to buy a home. Now, in Berkeley especially, it's about 15. So it is just wholly out of reach for so many of our residents to own a home and to buy one on a normal working class median income salary. So that has put housing out of reach for so many and resulted in our affordability crisis. So how does that relate to our homelessness crisis, which is, I think, what a lot of us here are working on and focused on? Well, our basis for relating that is we are the people that provide funding for housing creation is really the idea that homelessness is a housing problem. And we based it on this. It's a short book, I recommend it, called Homelessness is a Housing Problem, that basically explains the reason that we are seeing such a high amount of homelessness in our metropolitan region as compared to others. It's not because we have more addiction, more mental health problems, more anything else, more lower-income people. It is that we have a housing problem, and rents are higher here. So if you are on a fixed income or a low income, you have a tough time meeting that rent, and it's always going to keep increasing. And we have a low vacancy rate. So if you lose some income, if you lose your job, if there's death in your family, if your rent goes up and you can no longer afford your current place to live, there are very few alternatives for you in the market, and that's what results in people being pushed out. And of course, as I think makes sense, all of these other confounding factors around mental health, around addiction, around lower income, just means that the people who are holding on by their fingernails are the ones who are going to get pushed off when the market gets tight, which it is here. So that's our understanding of the crisis and how we need to address it. We really need to do something about housing, about the cost of housing and its availability, so that we can address these point-in-time numbers that keep growing and showing that we have this homelessness crisis. So this is our way of understanding that and sort of putting that in context, and our indicator for that is housing cost burden. Basically, how many people in Alameda County and in each of the cities in the county are paying more than they can afford to have a home. And that's divided into, are you housing cost burden, meaning you pay more than 30%, or are you severely cost burdened, meaning you pay more than 50%. And those are the people who are really struggling to survive in this market, and the people who are most at risk of becoming homeless or experiencing homelessness. So as we can see, this is our analysis based on American Community Survey, basically census data, that shows that most of our housing ecosystem is healthy. That's the green bit. Most people in the Alameda County, most households, about 373,000 households, are not experiencing cost burden. They can afford the homes they live in. They are overwhelmingly moderate income or above, meaning they make more than 80% of area median income. So those people are doing okay in this market. The problem is that we've got more than a third of people who are not doing okay in this market, who are in that unhealthy bit of the ecosystem where they are paying more than they can afford based on their incomes to have a home. And as we can see, as we move down towards that deep red portion of that market, it gets lower and lower income. And until you get to the severe cost burden, which is the overwhelming majority of that, is extremely low income, basically lowest income bracket we have, where you're making 30% or less, and still trying to afford housing. Michelle, do you have an addition?
Yeah, I just want you to point out, or maybe I'll point out, that the outer rim of the circle shows the income status, so mod plus means over income, but low income, very low income are also shown on that side. And what's really important here, what's really What's really important here is that there are low income, very low income, and extremely low income people who are doing fine. That's because they either live in affordable housing, they have a Section 8 voucher, or they have a historic property in their family that doesn't have a mortgage on it, and they can afford the upkeep and the maintenance on that property. And so we know that with subsidy, people can be fine. Low income, extremely low income people can be fine in a market if they have the resources. So I just really wanted to point that out. Thanks.
Exactly. And then conversely, like I mentioned, on the deep red part of this market, a huge portion of that is extremely low income. And we actually did the same analysis over time. And what we saw is that this green portion of the graph is getting larger. More of our ecosystem is healthy by some measure. People are avoiding it. But the percentage of lower income people, and especially extremely low and very low income people, who make up that extremely cost burdened part of that graph is increasing. So while maybe getting better for some, the part of this market that is unlivable is getting worse for the people who have the hardest time affording it. And that's why this is one of the biggest measures we've been focusing on, because that's where the market is going. And it's also, these are people who are at the highest risk of losing their housing and experiencing homelessness. And that's the 9,500 households or so, the blue part of this, which is the people who fall out of those unhealthy parts and experience homelessness on any given night in Alameda County based on our most recent point in time numbers. So this is basically our key indicator that we're using as part of this housing plan. And I want to highlight, we did this for each, that graph I just showed you is for the entire county. We did this for each jurisdiction within the county. So we can look at it for Oakland, for Berkeley, we can look at it for the unincorporated regions of the county, and we can see how this plays out a little differently. Across the board, we see the same general trends. About a third of the ecosystem is unhealthy. It has people paying more than they can afford, and that is across the board, condensed in the lowest income portions of the population. But there is difference. Like we can see in the unincorporated county, a little bit more of it is healthier versus in Oakland, where a bit more than a third is cost burdened or severely cost burdened. So this does play out a little differently depending on where we're talking about and what jurisdiction. Now, we also have to mention, in addition to the disparity about depending on what your income level is, there's of course a huge disparity based on racial lines. And this is using Bay Area Equity Atlas data to basically just show the disparate impact depending on the race of a household and residents of how they're experiencing that housing market. And it shows that if you are not white, and especially if you're a Black household, there's a much higher chance that you are facing that really difficult part of the market to deal with, where you are cost burdened or severely cost burdened. And we can see that, for a Black household, there's about 17% more likely to be cost burdened and 13% more likely to be severely cost burdened than a white household. As we cover in the plan, there is a huge amount of things that explain this, probably decades of government intervention in the housing market along racist lines, as well as continuing discrimination that we need to redress, but it needs to be acknowledged as part of this that there is the effect of the income and there's the effect of race. That means that lower income Black households are often at the very bottom of this system. So how do we start addressing that? Well, we use the framework that hopefully a lot of us are familiar with of the 3 Ps, of reducing, getting some echo. I don't know if someone can mute. No, it's online somewhere. Everyone online can mute, thank you. We're using the 3 Ps framework. Basically, we want to produce more affordable housing for lower incomes. We want to preserve the affordable housing we already have, make sure it doesn't become not affordable housing, and make sure it's upkept. And we want to protect residents from displacement and experiencing homelessness while this market is changing. So that's where we're organizing all of our policy around, and we want to have a 3-pronged approach that gets to all 3 of these things. So that's the overall strategy, but to get to some specifics, we've got some challenges there. Like we've talked about today, our funding environment is not ideal. One of the biggest sources of funding we get to address some of this problem is federal funding. But our federal funding is not keeping up with what we need. This chart basically just shows our home and community development block grant funding, two of the biggest federal funding sources that get channeled through the county and that we have to invest in affordable housing resources. And if we control those for inflation and we control those for the growth of population in our county, their real value has declined by over half over the past 2 decades. We are just not seeing those investments in those grants rise to the same extent as we need them to, given how much our population is growing and given how much everything is getting more expensive to build. And that puts us in a very difficult place because it puts more and more of the responsibility on local governments who need to find new ways to fund housing on that local level with far fewer resources. Because the federal government has a lot more resources than our county does. That said, we can start to break down what that need is and how much we need to build if we have the resources to do it. Basically, we break that down the plan by 3 tranches that build on one another. So these are additive of things we would need to do to turn that ecosystem green and make it healthy. First of those is the units we need to end homelessness. This is from the Everyone Home, from the All Home plan of how many units we need to really rapidly rehouse people, put them in shelters, and make sure we have the resources for people experiencing homelessness. So that means we can make that brief and rare. That means a certain amount of permanent supportive housing units, basically, cheap units for the lowest income bracket that have permanent supports on them. That means a certain amount of units, not just for permanent supportive housing, but for medically frail households that have disability or that have special needs. It means about 10,000 acutely low-income households. That's the one even just below extremely low income, where you're making 20% of area median income or less. And it means about 2,200 new shelter beds. That's a lot of units, but that's what our best estimate of what we need to address the homelessness crisis of people experiencing homelessness and trying to keep people from falling into it. If we do that, and then we want to go further and meet our RHNA goals, our regional housing needs allocation, basically the amount we've been assigned by the state and by the regional government to build in Alameda County, which everyone gets every 8 years, is supposed to guide their investment and how many affordable units they're trying to create. Then we need about 37,000 units on top of those units needed to end homelessness. And those break down basically by income level. So we need about 16,000 extremely low income, for people making below 30% of area median income. We need about 7,500 very low income, those making 50% or less. And we need about 13,500 lower income units, basically for people making between 50 and 80% of their area median income. If we do that, and we want to go further and actually eliminate that severe cost burden, so make sure that there is nobody in Alameda County who is paying more than 50% of their income towards housing, so is not in that most vulnerable section of the housing market where they're most in danger of losing their housing or one financial shock could see them on the street. We need to invest even further and build about 38,000 more units at those lowest income levels. Like I mentioned earlier, the portion of the housing ecosystem that is made up of people paying more than 50% of their income on housing for severe cost burden is overwhelmingly the lowest income brackets. So we need primarily extremely low income units, and we need very low income units. Michelle, you have an addition.
I want to make sure everybody understands that this is an astronomical number of units. We're being incredibly blunt and clear here. This is more units than our county has put in place in 30 years. So I will give you some context. Since 1992, when the federal home program started, Alameda County Housing Department built, funded 3,000 affordable units with our home grant. 3,000 over 30 years or 27 years. When we passed Measure A1, which was $580 million, we built another 4,300 units in 7 years. Let me tell you, that was a huge heavy lift. But we're talking about way more than that. And I say this because I want to be blunt and clear, and I want everyone to understand the scale and scope of this problem. This is not a situation where any one part of our government is going to be able to step in and fix it. This means that every part of our government, the federal, state, and local governments, all of the cities and the counties, have to work together to reach any part of these goals. And I think that that is the critical piece that people need to understand. Local government, number one thing they pay for is safety, police and fire. After that, they start thinking about administration, they start thinking about parks and rec, and then they start getting into health and human services, which is at the bottom of that rung. And housing, most local governments are not investing their general fund in housing. They are investing the money they get from the federal or the state government. So in order for the local government to have housing money, they have to tax their people. So I'm just putting this out there. This is an astronomical number, and we have to understand the actual scale and scope. Okay?
Michelle's completely right. It's a large number. I'm going to throw another large number at you of how much we would need to build this amount. To build just the most in need part, that to deal with homelessness, we need about $5 billion. To go a step farther and build our arena, we need another almost $11 billion. To go a step further and deal with the hardest hit part of the market, everyone left who's paying more than they can afford on housing, we need about another $11 billion. So in total, we need about $27 billion to solve this problem. Easy, right? As Michelle said, that is an astronomical sum. It is not achievable tomorrow. It's probably not achievable over the course of much longer time frames. But it's important to understand that that is what we would need to really address this problem completely on a local level. And it is a very difficult finish line to get to. But it's very important to understand that that's the hill we are trying to climb up. And that's why when we invest and tax ourselves to pay for these services, that's why we are not seeing the problem be magically solved when we invest $10 million, because we need a order of magnitude greater than that. Now, how do we start addressing that? Which is what our plan tries to get into. We sort of present the challenge of getting there and the blunt reality of it, but we want to start trying to get us closer to that point. So one of the ways is we have to be aware of racial equity, and like I mentioned earlier, of the racial impacts and disparate impacts of the system as it exists now. One of the ways we're trying to do that in part of this plan is, have these metrics of understanding the long-term impacts in the context of our work and tracking it based on how much are we doing to alleviate and address the disparate impact for housing cost burden. So make it so that if you are not white, you are not much more likely to be facing a much higher cost burden than a white household. How much are we making it so that there is not a hugely disproportionate amount of non-white, especially Black households who are experiencing chronic homelessness? Are we doing things that can decrease housing segregation, access to opportunity, so basically allow homes to be built in places that encourage opportunity and allow people access to these great societal benefits that we know everyone should have access to? And how are we investing in the communities that have been historically ignored so that they are able to build wealth and circulate money within those communities so that they can really build up? Those are all metrics we are trying to apply to all of our work and as part of this plan to measure the success. Another way of understanding this, Michelle mentioned Measure A1. Measure A1, for anyone who doesn't know, is our affordable housing bond that the county passed in 2016 that had about $580 million for local housing funding. That was a hugely successful program. We have invested about 97% of the rental funds from that program and created over 4,000 units of housing, which, as Michelle mentioned, is more than we had created in the past decade or more before we had Measure A1. But it also means that we have extended it. This is a successful use of money where Alameda County residents agreed to tax themselves to pay for housing, and we used it. We created homes. We especially created homes at the lowest part of the income spectrum. We had a goal in that program to have at least 20% of homes built affordable to people making 20% or less of area median income, and we surpassed that goal. So we can effectively leverage these funds at the local level when we get them to start creating this housing. And one of the best parts of that, I said leverage, because for every dollar we invested in Measure A1, we were getting an additional $7 invested in each of those projects from federal sources, from regional sources, from state level sources, and from other local sources. So if we have money at that local level, even if the amount we need to build and the amount of money we need to build it is astronomical, we can unlock other sources of money to build that and to support our building it here. It just takes that initial local investment that, like Michelle mentioned, cities and counties are often struggling to find or tax themselves to create. So from that process, we know that we need to invest in affordable housing in a way that just doesn't happen in market rate, where you need local subsidy to unlock everything else, and you need it to underwrite the cost. We know that the deeper the affordability level, the more expensive that housing is going to be. That's a lot of that's just math of if you're charging the people who live in it a lower rent, like we should be, so that they can afford it. We need more money to cover all the other costs of maintaining that building, like the insurance, like the management, like the maintenance of that building, so that ensures that the people living in it have access to the highest quality housing possible, which they should. We know that the resources from federal government, while we've been trying to increase our local resources, have not been growing. Like I mentioned earlier, that home and CDBG funding has not been expanding the way we need it to, and we at the local level have been forced to take up more and more of the gap and invest more and more local resources. And we also know that we need local governments to have more of those resources to invest if we're going to fill up more of that space. So that's a lot we learned from Measure A1 and what we're trying to build on with this plan, even if we don't necessarily have all the sources of funding identified yet. Another success case that we can look at, which I think was mentioned earlier today about VASH and veterans homeless benefits. For a long time in this country, veterans homelessness across the nation was a huge crisis, and still is to some extent. But we have done a huge amount to address it nationwide due to concerted effort on the federal, state, and local level. This is a success case that we should take to learn what we can do to address homelessness in a more widespread way, because when the federal and the state and the local government are all on the same side and say this is a priority and we want to invest in it, then we can see market reductions. And we can see that veteran homelessness across the nation has fallen by half since 2009. And we can see that we can get more people in shelter, and that's because Congress spent billions of dollars on it. They funded VASH, which is Veterans Housing Vouchers. They funded other housing voucher programs and other wraparound services. Again, it's not a perfect system. We haven't eliminated veterans homelessness by any means, and still a problem around here. But this is what we can do when we all are pushing in the same direction, in a way that we haven't seen the federal government do for homelessness writ large or for affordable housing writ large in our crisis more broadly. So, how are we going to start addressing some of these issues? And what's our sort of plan? And we're in the process of actually improving this 10-year housing plan and making more of what I'm about to detail around our strategies into a really actionable strategic plan. But like I said earlier, we're basing it around 3 Ps. So we want to do production, preservation, protection. So production, that's around Measure A1, around a lot of our work at HCD is what we do historically, where we are funding affordable housing developers to create housing. So we want to do more of that funding. We want to be providing that operating subsidy, basically the soft costs that we know affordable housing developments need to keep providing the wraparound services and affordability they need long term. That means we want to be funding not only permanent housing, but interim housing, homeless shelters, shelter beds, things that people can use as resources. It means we also want to help those emergent developers, land trusts, faith and community-based organizations, basically smaller developers who can take advantage of resources like a church parking lot to have sort of smaller than the traditional 60 to 70 unit affordable housing project. It also means we want to create not just rental, but we want to be investing in first-time homebuyer opportunities for lower-income households so they can build equity. It means we want to secure those sort of time-limited sites. We want to be able to snap up property that could be a good target for affordable housing before it goes off the market. And it means we want to be encouraging a diverse amount of types of affordable housing, like accessory dwelling units with technical and financial assistance. That's a brief rundown of our production strategies. Like I said, we are detailing this more in the plan and have a lot of these as this is our traditional bread and butter. But that is one of the big parts of this plan. We also want to be doing preservation, like I mentioned. A good way of not losing the distance we've made over time is we need to repair and replace existing homeless shelters, permanent affordable housing, transitional units, basically making sure that we aren't losing affordable housing that we already have when it comes to the end of its natural affordable lifespan. Most affordable units come online with a 55-year restriction of how long they have to be affordable. We want to make sure that when that 55 years comes up, we are reinvesting in those units to keep them affordable. It means we want to encourage the preservation of naturally occurring affordable housing because we know there's a lot of people who are in affordable housing and that means they can afford it, but there are also people who are lower income who are in naturally occurring affordable housing, basically cheaper market rate housing that we want to not only encourage to keep existing, but upkeep so that cheaper doesn't mean worse. Lastly, we want to revitalize and preserve those mobile homes, which are often a source of housing for people at the lowest income spectrums because they are more affordable, though they come with their own unique challenges that we want to help people address. And then lastly, on protection, there is a lot we'd like to do, but in put it briefest, we want to prevent harassment and basically illegal action against tenants. We want to make sure that they have the protections they need based by state law, by local law, by federal law, know their rights, that they have the resources they need, legal assistance, legal advice they need to do that. We want to provide that sort of local gap funding that they may need, like emergency rental assistance. If we have people who are in danger of losing their housing, who might experience homelessness because they can't pay rent for a month, because they lost a job, or because they had an unanticipated medical emergency. Sort of keep doing some of the work we started during the pandemic and then have slowed down on since. And we also want to expand our tenant protections beyond those provided under state law. We're working on this right now. The Board of Supervisors is going to be hearing a just cause ordinance for the unincorporated county next month. Hopefully they'll pass it. And that will help us keep doing this work, but we want to keep working and looking at what other protections do we need, what makes sense on the ground in unincorporated Alameda County, as well as in all the cities within the county. Yes, Michelle.
So it's also really important to know who's in charge of tenant protections. Tenant protections follow land use rules, which means that it's the city council responsible for that jurisdiction that can or cannot adopt tenant protection. So if you want just cause, it's the city council. The Board of Supervisors is only responsible for the unincorporated county. Unincorporated county is a lot bigger than everybody thinks it is. Who knows where the unincorporated county is? Ashland, Cherryland, Castro Valley, it's 155,000 people. A lot of them extremely local. But in any case, it's right behind Hayward in size of population. So the fourth largest city, if it's a city. But if you want just cause expanded in Fremont or in San Leandro, it's those city councils that are responsible for that.
Yep. So that's the briefest version of the summary of our plan that I can give. It is a long document, which we're trying to make shorter and more readable. But how the process is going is we released that on August 1st. We had a comment period that lasted until the beginning of this month, and
But
we're
we're still taking public comments.
Yes.
We want to send it then.
we're still taking public comments. So please, if you have thoughts, please send them to us because we are actively working right now to improve this plan, to revise it based on the feedback we got from public presentations like this, and that we will get hopefully from people in this room. And then we're going to bring that plan back to the Board of Supervisors for approval so that we have a really actionable plan that lays out what we want to do over the next 10 years for the department to address the housing crisis we have. And with that, I think we're done. I'll hand it to Michelle.
Thank you. A couple of really important things, and then I'll answer some questions. This is all based on a housing needs assessment. We did a countywide housing needs assessment. Every local government does a housing needs assessment as part of their housing element, which is part of the RENA from the state regional housing needs assessment from the state of California. And you have to do it every 8 years, right? Because that's the requirement. Well, this is the first time we've ever done a countywide one. So we waited until all the housing elements were done. And then we went out and we looked at what everybody's housing needs were, and we rolled it up into this one plan. And there is actually a website, and I'm hoping you can find it. Can you go online maybe? Chris, or can you guys help us get online? Because I want to show the website. Is that possible?
Yes.
Because I thought we had a QR code.
Do you love watching me like think through the process before I verbally commit?
So on our housing needs assessment website is, we're taking a survey. And if you want to tell your story, the importance of housing in your life, if you want to share with the Board of Supervisors or any of the city council members, frankly, because they're all reading this, please do go online and share your story. Because how do we advocate for more money? We make it personal. We make it real. We talk about why it is important to actual people, not just all those statistics up on the wall. So I do want to encourage you. See, I never find it. There it is, Housing News Report. No, that's California Housing Partnership. Anyways, please do go on our website.
I put the link in the chat.
Thank you. The link is in the chat. All right, Deidre, you had a question.
Go first, Deidre.
I was just wondering about the terminology you use, and I'd like to know what deed restricted affordable homes are.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So what is a deed restriction? Let's just start with that. A deed restriction is something that goes on the land. It's not a physical land, but it goes on the legal description of the property, and it runs with the land. So if the property transfers ownership, that deed restriction stays on the property and doesn't get wiped out like a mortgage would when it gets repaid. So it stays on the property for a really long time. Now, different funding sources have different requirements, and as a local government, it's our job to make sure that we put a deed restriction on that property that we funded. So that, for instance, if what we're saying is you must rent 5 units at 50% of area median income and 10 units at 30 and 25 at 10%, then that's what's in their deed restriction. And it's called a regulatory agreement, that's what we call it. But when we close a loan on an affordable housing project, we have all of these legal documents. They include a promissory note. You promise to repay us if you ever violate our regulatory agreement. That's my hook. That's how I know they're gonna keep it, because otherwise I can take the building back. So this is my hook. There's a promissory note, a loan agreement, a regulatory agreement, and a deed of trust. And that deed of trust cements it all onto the property so that if anybody ever tries to sell it, they have to come and ask us, why is this here? And would you remove it? And we say, no, we're not gonna remove it.
Is that on all properties that you guys build, or?
All of the properties that the county finances. I was gonna say that I finance, but it's not me, it's the
So
county.
this is perpetually the one prior?
Yeah, so we have been, okay, so here's a sob story. We've been funding affordable housing since 1972. And from 1972 until about 92, there were no federal rules around how you restricted it. And in 88, we helped open a homeless shelter in Livermore. It was a women's domestic violence shelter, and it was a single-family home. It was a large single-family home. We got a use permit, which was really hard to get. And I wasn't there in 88, but I read the records. And the nonprofit that was operating it refinanced it over and over and over again until they pulled all of the equity out of it, and we didn't have any deed restrictions on it because that wasn't a thing back then. And so when they went out of business in 98, we had to buy the thing back again, even though we'd already paid for it. So that was a major lesson to local government. So Livermore, Pleasanton, Dublin, and the county all had to buy that building again. And we did, because that building was important, but the nonprofit had been pulling cash out of the real estate in order to operate their organization.
Just shady.
Well, whether it was, I don't know, they were gone. So by the time all of this happened, I wasn't able to go back and audit them, but they probably didn't have enough operating sources. They probably didn't have enough money to provide services. And they probably pulled cash out to pay for salaries, to provide the services to the domestic violence victims who were living there. But they shouldn't have,
They used it for overhead, okay, got it.
probably. Okay,
Let's hope so.
let's hope so. Fingers crossed that that's really what happened, it was a long time ago now. Cheryl?
So this report says 93,000 housing, 93,000 housing units for $27 billion. So
That's the local investment needed to build it. We still need first mortgages and tax credit equity and other financing. That's the local money.
So this $20 billion, the bond that didn't end up on the ballot.
And that wasn't even, so the $20 billion bond that didn't make it on the ballot, which, that would have brought $2 billion into Alameda County and almost another $900 million into Oakland, $800 million into Oakland. So it would have been almost $3 billion towards that $27 billion number that we need. Which is what I was saying earlier. It's not one and done, it's 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4. This is gonna take years to build this housing and we need to get there. Through multiple steps. Yes, James?
I've got a number of questions, but I'll start with this one. The AMI, the area median income, it's really skewed for Oakland. For instance, the AMI, the area median income for family of 4, according to HUD for Oakland, is about $103,000 a year. So it says the average person in Oakland makes $103,000 a year, family of 4. But the average income for a family in the flatlands below the MacArthur Freeway is $47,000 a year. So you build something that's called affordable. HUD says it's affordable to a family that's making $103,000 to $110,000 a year. But there's nothing for the family making $47,000 a year. So new housing is being built that won't be bought by anyone who lives in Flatlands Local.
So let me slow down and let me give some context so that everybody can understand this. First of all, HUD divides the country and creates area median incomes across the entire United States, and it's all specific to each geographic region, right? And our geographic region is Contra Costa and Alameda County combined. We are one region. So it is not specific to the city, to any one city. It is specific to 2 counties, which tends to skew it higher, so you're completely correct. The second part of that is when we build affordable housing, everything has to be at 80% or below, or it's not affordable. And secondly, our office doesn't build anything more than 50% or below in the rental world. And that would then be affordable to someone, a household of four making $50,000 a year in Oakland. But here's the other part of it. If you're building housing at 50% or below, at 50%, you can pay for the operations of that building. If 100% of the building was at 50%, you would be breaking even on the income coming in, the rental payments, and the costs. Garbage, water, utilities, personnel, maintenance, janitorial, landscaping, all of that, and it breaks even. But as soon as you start going lower than that, 40%, 30%, 20%, you need an operating subsidy. Meaning those households can't pay in rent what it costs to operate. Hence, we desperately need operating subsidies like Section 8 vouchers. We are significantly below what we need in Section 8 vouchers for this community. And we, in the 10-year housing plan, went ahead and identified if we wanted everybody who needed a voucher to get one, what would that cost us? Who there remembers the number? It's like an extra $2 billion a year in Section 8 vouchers to our.
Yeah, I'll just highlight that with my final comment. What you say is very true. The last two affordable housing complexes that have been approved for construction in Oakland. Well, let me say this first. 5 years ago, it cost about $500,000 to $600,000 a unit to produce a unit, bring a new unit onto the market. The last two affordable housing complexes that have been approved locally cost $1.1 million per unit. So with that kind of cost, I don't know how we're ever going to subsidize the number of units that are needed to house people.
I think you're right. I think we have seen one of the fastest growing cost escalations in the last 5 years. COVID specifically interrupted a significant, supply chain process, and our cost of lumber went up, but so was our cost of labor, right? In order to live here, you've got to make more. And so what we're seeing really is a cost in supplies and a cost in labor, and we need people to get paid enough to live here, right? So how do you argue with that? I think opening up what tax credits would pay for is really important. So think about it, if I can buy a 3-bedroom, 1-bath house in the flatlands of Oakland for $700,000, why are we not buying all of those single-family homes? It would cost us less. Tax credits are about new construction or rehabilitation of multifamily properties. How do we go to the federal government and say, hey, we want you to allow us to build tiny homes with tax credits. We want you to allow us to buy and rehab single-family homes with tax credits. We don't want you to restrict us to just this one methodology. I mean, that's frankly one of the strategies we have to employ.
Michelle, we've got some mics that are already, maybe we're actually, may I do the question for you, so I'm gonna reclaim my time. Thank you for this, and I think one question that I wonder if you all have felt this in public response as we have in the past for the Home Together plan, that I think we're trying to ameliorate in the new plan, is distinguishing a bleak, overwhelming needs assessment from a plan, right? And what do you see as kind of the plan, the action part of what, in some ways, and I think part of what we're trying to do and getting feedback on the Home Together plan is like, we kind of did a needs assessment for the first 5 years too that didn't have a lot of action, but needs. So I'm curious what you all think might be some of the, in the midst of the bleakness, what are some action steps? So that's one question. And then on top of that, I guess, part of what I struggle with this idea of and I'm curious how this factors into the ecosystems or the cost burden, is cost burden is problematic in some ways,
Because it assumes that like cost burden when you're at 100% AMI plus is just as much a problem as if you're at 30% AMI or less.
We didn't include anybody that was over 80%.
Okay, great.
And we didn't include, any of the 30 to 50% in that 93 number. So if you're paying 30 to 50%, you're not counted.
You're not counted, okay.
So it's only 50% or above.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think that's really helpful for that.
Note, you guys, make sure that's clear.
Because wealthy folks can be cost burdened all day. It's fine to pay more than 30% of your income on housing if you make hundreds of thousands a year, you know.
Yeah.
The last question is really kind of that question of, I think about some of the data that Mark shared yesterday around how much folks were paying for housing before, and that their income was $980, Part of where I struggle when we talk about it from like the $1 million, like the current industrial complex of building affordable housing and the industry around it, is that it does feel so unattainable because clearly our current system and the way we build stuff, tax credits included, are not gonna do it, right? So what can we do? What is the scrappy thing we can do, right? What is the ways in which we can sort of afford and scale things locally, acquisition-wise? Like what, the cost profile, supporting people in shared environments. Like are there any sort of, from an infrastructure perspective, thoughts you all have that we can do that is knocking some of this off, that doesn't depend on the massive regional bond that in the ever-changing political climate seems
Undoable right now. I'm gonna try and incorporate 1 and 3 together. So what are the strategies and, what scrap thing can we do, which is, frankly, very similar. Produce, protect, and preserve is the framework. So yes, we have to produce more, but what are we gonna produce? Obviously, without a lot of resources to bring the tax credits in, we've gotta start looking at smaller sites, we've gotta start looking at smaller developers that can rely upon local dollars to just build one thing with just local money and not leveraging federal dollars. We have to look at land banking, meaning buying those sites and keeping them for ourselves so that corporations don't get them. We have to be looking at, and I'm just gonna say tiny home villages. Frankly, First Pres Church did a great job of building a tiny home village on its parking lot, but can we find other churches to do the same thing? Those are the kinds of things we need to do with whatever resources we have right now, right? That's really critical. And then being scrappy, frankly, John, thank you. He's been out there looking at sites. So he's gonna meet with my team. We're gonna start inventorying sites and evaluating those sites for what we could do on them. Because our mainstream developers don't wanna build homeless housing. They wanna go build tax credit housing. And that's what they're built for and that's what they're supposed to do. But we're gonna need to increase the number of developers who want to build these smaller projects. And frankly, we're seeing the churches really come into that community, and we've done a lot for capacity building with the churches. We want to do more. Sharon. Yeah.
Thank you.
She has a lot of good information for you.
All right. Can I ask the members of the Housing Capacity Committee to stand if you're able, or to raise your hand? And that would be, I think some folks are on Zoom today. Colleen, Stacy, Jared, Sebida, Isamar, Sochi, Michelle, where are you? Hey, you're standing already, very good. Jeannie was with us, Carolyn, Vivian, and Mo, thank you. Michelle, you have in your email a letter from the Housing Capacity Committee, which we successfully wrote as a group. Getting along all the time. And I'm told not to read the whole thing, but I want to call your attention to some of the key points, which really back up what you're saying in terms of what the urgent needs are in the community. One of the pieces we want to call out is you're hearing different percentages of area median income. So in the plan looking backwards, there's lots of talk about 30%. We have a new law in California, Isaac Ryan, AB 1043, that calls out 15% of area median income. And those are St. Mary's seniors on SSI. Anybody trying to make it on $1,000 a month is at about 15% of area median income. And we note that many parts of the plan reference that new standard. It's called acutely low income, income so low it impacts your health, right? Critically important. Our recommendations begin with noting that Alameda County kept the promise of Measure A1 and delivered more than 4,000 new homes with more than 20% going, people at that time, it was 20% of area median income, and reduced unsheltered homelessness. So we have to start by saying we've got solutions. It's not just the bleakness of the problem, we've got solutions. We call on housing and homelessness and housing and community development to align strategies and align plans, which are both in plan development, moving for slightly different pacing at this time, but to align those plans so that the operating subsidies and the services are there to go with the housing as it comes online. And I think a lot of the really great ideas that have come up today, Nick, you're not standing. Nick's part of our housing capacity. Nick, thank you. But we said, look at acquisition and rehab of existing affordable units. We said, look at shallow subsidies and direct payments. That's come up a few times today. Expansion of time periods for rapid rehousing participants. Tenant protections. Demanding adequate federal action. Actively seeking out landlords, property improvements, landlord-tenant counseling, options for shelter and leases, and then maintaining or improving the promise of Measure A1 in its renewal to dedicate a minimum of 25% of resources to people at 15% or below area median income. And we're ready to work with Alameda County to secure that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to say thank you to the Housing Capacity Committee. That was probably the best letter and the most detailed response to our plan that we got. And so I just really want to appreciate all of those of you who worked on that. Thank you very much. And our time is up.